Welcome to the Resilience Files, a podcast investigating human stories of struggle and triumph in the quest to explore the true nature of well-being and resilience and discover the secret to a resilience that lasts. My guest today is Mitesh Sheth, MBE, the Chief Investment Officer at Newton Investment Management. Mitesh was suggested as a podcast guest by various colleagues of mine after delivering a resilience training program at Newton, which Mitesh himself attended. Mitesh obviously made an impression, and when I met him a few weeks ago, I understood why. Not only is he an incredibly smart and accomplished individual, but he's a person who, despite, or perhaps because of, some very significant challenges he experienced in his early life, is committed to learning, evolving, and bettering himself and the world around him. That said, Mitesh is a wonderfully understated, humble, and unassuming leader, what I would call a gentle changemaker. Mitesh qualified from London School of Economics with a BSc in Actuarial Science. After graduating, he spent a year in India studying at a monastery, a school of philosophy, and he's a fellow of the Institute of Actuaries and a member of the Diversity Project's Advisory Board. Mitesh has been recognized for creating one of the industry's most open, innovative, and inclusive workplace cultures, and for putting diversity at the top of the agenda when he was the CEO of Reddington. Reddington being one of the first companies in financial services to close its gender pay gap in 2019. Unsurprisingly, Mitesh received an MBE in 2022 in recognition for his contributions. This conversation spans a childhood in Bolton and India, being a member of a gang, spending a year in the monastery, struggling to belong and be comfortable in your own skin, grappling as a teenager with mental health challenges, and lots more. So Mitesh, welcome to the Resilience Files. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Terry.
Oh, you're welcome. So I've really been looking forward to this conversation ever since we connected a few weeks ago, and there are so many threads and themes in your story that I feel that I'd love to explore further in this conversation, and I feel are really relevant and important. Especially they speak a lot to what we as humans grapple with when it comes to resilience and overcoming adversity. So you ready to get started?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, Mitesh, an overarching theme that we grapple with as humans, at least many of us do, is that of wanting to belong, and a feeling that we don't belong, that we don't fit in, wanting to be included and be a part of things, be accepted for who we are and feel comfortable in our own skin. And I know that this has been a kind of lifelong challenge for you, and the roots of it began in your early childhood, as they do for many of us. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the circumstances that precipitated this challenge, this feeling of not belonging.
I'm really happy to do that. And as you said, it starts really early on. For me, I was born in Bolton, in Lancashire, and we lived in a council house with all my dad's brothers and sisters, and we were there for about 4 years, and I'd started kind of nursery, I guess, at the time, but I was probably one of the only children of colour there, and so really early age was a little different to others. What was really interesting is when I was 4 years old, I went to India. So my dad was born in Africa, had never gone back to India where his ancestors were from. And we ended up staying for 4 or 5 years. So I did my primary school there, and I looked like everyone else in India. So quite a stark difference from Bolton, Manchester. But the reality was I was completely different, and so I was very much seen as the outsider within this kind of primary school there. So it was really interesting that you could kind of look like everyone else and culturally and religiously be very aligned, but still feel very much like the outsider. And then that was all compounded when I was about 8 or 9. We came back to England when my grandfather wasn't well, and my dad decided to put me into secondary school here. And by then I had an Indian accent, and we were in Crawley near Gatwick Airport because my parents were the airport had just opened, so there was a lot of jobs. And so they were working shifts at the airport. And I was bullied on the playground and beyond, because I was kind of this outsider who didn't really fit in. So those themes of belonging started really early, and I kind of knew I was a bit of an outsider. I was an only child, so my social skills weren't great. I tended to be most comfortable with my parents' friends rather
Mhm.
than with people my own age.
Mhm.
And that kind of continued on. I don't think I realized that we were poor until, I guess into my teens, when my friends started to buy computers and have
Mhm.
gaming consoles, and it was all about buying the latest trainers and things like that. And my clothes were often bought in India and then shipped to us here, or they'd be hand-me-downs that were passed down through the family, and we definitely weren't getting the latest trainers or the latest computers and
Mhm.
things. So again, there was just this thing that I'm not good enough, as not I'm not the same as everyone else. I don't really fit in. That I think that definitely. I remember coming home from school and have memories of my grandmother would be around for some of the year, staying with us, and I would just cry in her lap, because I just felt really, unloved, unwanted, didn't fit in, didn't belong. It was I
Wow.
think it's such a deep human need, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
I've actually
and
thought about that in a way, and thought about like the roots of it, and thinking of us as tribes and needing to be part of a tribe for your survival. If you were excommunicated or kicked out of a tribe, you couldn't survive. And so I think it is such a almost, primal need of ours to belong and be part of something. Yeah.
yeah, I agree, and I think for me, finding that tribe, for a part of it, and I was definitely searching for it. Um, and I found it a little bit with kind of groups, and even gangs to some extent. So certainly at school, as we were kind of getting into our kind of 14, 15, there was this real sense of belonging to other kids, even though I didn't agree with what everyone was doing, even though I didn't agree with the kind of antisocial behavior, or
Mm,
alcohol or drugs, or a lot of it. And I didn't fully fit in. I felt like they had my back. I felt
yes.
like they would have protected me. And growing
Mm,
up in Crawley at that time, there was a lot of immigrants had come into the town because of the airport, and so there really was a bit of a gang type culture.
mm,
And I remember once I was out on the high street, and somebody just kind of came up to me and started punching me, started hitting me in the head,
mhm.
completely unprovoked. Um, and it was around that time that this whole gang of other kind of young people had come to, not on that day, but after that, to say, right, we've got to look after you. We've got to go back and get him and his people. And all of a sudden I felt there were people who had my back and who were gonna protect me and look after me.
Yeah.
And so I
I,
felt a real sense of, despite so much of it jarring, I was able to look past it, because I felt like they cared and they were there for me almost.
yeah. You told me that story, and it really stuck with me because the kind of juxtaposition. Because what you didn't mention right now is that you had written a biography of your grandmother, of her life, and that you were carrying all the papers like in a box, and that was when you were kind of beaten up. And I was just thinking about that, like juxtaposition between being this kind of, you're 16, but obviously had the sensitivity, to be able to write your grandmother's memoir. Something, by the way, that I always wanted to do for my grandmother and never did. She lived into her 90s, and I regret. So I was very taken by that. And but there's a sweetness and a gentleness and a thoughtfulness to a boy that would be doing that, and then is getting kind of beaten up and in a gang. It like doesn't quite mesh. But I guess that's in our kind of ignorant understanding of a child on the streets and in a gang, as you say, and what would pull a child onto the streets and become part of a gang, as you say, a kind of sense of someone looking after you, being a part of something. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was. I remember, and it was just. I was doubly crying. I remember at the time because I was protecting these biographies with my life,
Nice.
and so I was like clinging to them like this whilst this person was kind of obviously laying into me.
Yeah.
Um, and and yeah, and I think that in itself was quite interesting because I remember feeling very sorry for myself and feeling very frustrated that we were in this situation as quite an angry young person, kind of that kind of 14, 15, 16, and wasn't sure how to express it. And my grandmother would come and live with us for during the summer months, and she'd been widowed as a young woman with 8 children in Africa, and she was a seamstress, so using her legs to sew clothes on those old kind of Singer machines, she'd kind of brought the whole family to the UK and faced a lot of discrimination and abuse over that time. But I never really knew any of that. But when she would come to stay with us, she would ask us to kind of massage her legs, and quite often we as children we would like walk on her legs because she would be in so much pain that she wouldn't even be able to feel that. I remember thinking, oh God, what a drag that I had to do this every
Yes.
night. And it was and it was through that when I kind of went, I've got to have to do this anyway, and I started to talk to her, and she would tell me about her life. And that's kind of where this came about, where I was like, oh my God, this is not just this old kind of frail woman, but there's this incredible woman who
Yes.
has faced such hardship and got us to where we are today. And I became more and more curious. I'd come home from school and I'd get through my work and I'd look forward to these sessions we'd have where I'd be kind of massaging her legs and she would be telling me her story. And I was like, I've got to write this down. And so that's kind of
Yes.
how that had come about. And it was again this juxtaposition, as you put it, because I was so frustrated with my situation. I felt so lonely. I felt quite angry at my parents, at the situation at school. School went. I'd come back from India with because they were a lot more, I guess, in some senses, advanced with particularly their maths and sciences teaching. And when I'd come to this kind of state school in Crawley, they'd said, "Oh, you're a couple of years ahead of the other kids. Can you just sit quietly at the back and not disrupt the class too much?"
Mhm.
And so, even with that, I was just angry. But I was
Mhm.
learning this beautiful history and this history of how my grandmother, nothing had gone her way, and she hadn't been defeated, and she hadn't given up, and she had persevered and thrived really, and all her children and their children had. And it really was around that age a real kind of eye-opening moment that
Mm.
I don't have to be defined by my circumstances.
That's amazing. I mean, what a role model. That's beautiful. And as you say, she was like on your doorstep and you didn't even know until you bumped into it, because of having to stand on her legs and get through that. What I love about what you say about your grandmother, and it pertains even when I think about the young Mitesh and, on the streets, is that, we don't see who a person is inside. We see such a superficial version of a person, and we talk about separate realities and that we can't really glimpse another person's world, which is so deep and so intimate, and
Yeah,
only themselves they have that. They say you should walk a mile in another person's shoes, but we can't do that. We can catch glimpses, and I think about like you in that moment, and I wonder if your grandmother was a person, because sometimes when a child's angry and acting out, it's very difficult to see the health and the goodness within them. I always think about Nelson Mandela as a role model. His famous quote, man's goodness is a flame that can be hidden but never extinguished.
yeah,
And, there's that. I always speak to parents when I'm speaking to them, say that we need to have laser eyes to see the health in our children, because the behavior that covers that is, and it's superficial, but often that's what we confronted with, and we begin to define them and parent them as if that's them, not seeing through to who they really are inside. And I was wondering, was there somebody in your life when you were struggling at that time that you felt could see through your kind of struggles to who you were, to that little boy?
That's such a great question. I don't think there was. I know my parents were, I mean, they were obviously very busy working and earning and providing. And when we would spend time together, they just couldn't understand why I was so angry and why I was um, behaving the way I was. I think it was particularly what one day I'd had all my friends over and had a house party where they kind of trashed the house, and I think my mum and dad were upstairs trying to sleep, and I remember it as a real turning point where they were like, there's something wrong. And my grades were starting to turn down, having been very good, because I almost didn't care anymore.
Yes.
And so they were getting more and more desperate. And, in a sense, yes, they did. They saw the, the goodness in me, but also for me, that was frustrating because I felt like they put me on a pedestal and I
Mm,
didn't feel like I was deserving of that. They were so incredibly proud of me, and they
mhm,
would show me off and my skills and talents and achievements to their friends, particularly when I was younger. And I really, the more I was doing bad things, the more I felt that I wasn't deserving of it, and so but I wasn't able to tell them that, and so
yes.
I was rejecting their affections and rejecting their attention and their praise. I know they got incredibly worried, and they being kind of I guess having come as immigrants into the UK and their parents immigrants from Africa, from India to Africa, kind of faith had not been a big part of their lives. Not certainly not my dad's life, maybe my mum a little. But it was a bit more of a handed down superstitious faith rather than something that she had
Mm,
really accepted. And it was around that time that I think in their own fear and desperation that they had reached out to faith. And there was like a spiritual teacher in India who was giving lectures on the Bhagavad Gita, so one of the Hindu scriptures, and it was done in a very clear and logical kind of scientific way, and in a very practical way. And somebody had asked my dad to come, and he'd gone and he'd loved these lectures, and they were kind of
mm,
recorded in India and kind of transmitted here to the UK and elsewhere in the world. And my dad had come to my mum and I and said, "Look, I kind of beg you, just give it 3 months."
yes.
And you can ask for anything you want. And I remember my mum and I used to love going to watch movies, and we couldn't always, it was expensive. And so we were like, okay, so we can, you'll come to you'll take us to the movies anytime we want to go, was our trade, basically,
Yes.
to the cinema. And so anyway, we'd gone, and I remember sitting very reluctantly at the back with my shoes on, even though everyone had taken their shoes off, and
Uh-huh.
not removing my jacket so that I wasn't fully committing. And over time, as I started listening and interacting with all of these incredible people who were learning, that we all have this divinity or goodness within us, and how life is discovering that divinity and connecting with that with other people. And you had this group of people who are trying to practice that, in their own kind of flawed
Mm,
and other ways. And it was beautiful. And I wasn't willing to accept it initially, but I
mhm,
think it was actually my parents had gone to India for a long vacation. It wasn't a vacation, sorry. They'd gone to, it was like a pilgrimage, with the
mhm,
same group. And they said, well, while we're away, will you make notes
uh-huh,
for us? Because we don't want to miss the
mhm,
lectures.
mhm,
And so I'd kind of reluctantly agreed to. And as I did, I delved deeper and deeper into it. And I was blown away by the beauty and the simplicity, and it just struck a chord. It all
Yeah.
made sense. And I was like, I said, it was this, but that, I don't need to seek belonging externally. I don't need to look for that from someone else. I have
Yes.
this love, this abundance within me that I
Yeah.
need to connect to. And it was at the right time. I was kind of desperately in the need of it, and it changed my life really. So in a sense, it wasn't a person, but a kind of a whole philosophy of life that embraced me,
Yes. Yes.
um, that in a sense really rescued me, if I'm honest. And my parents still to this day, say we were so scared and we had no idea what would come of you.
Yes.
I know some of the kids I was hanging around with, one of them had taken a drug overdose, one of them had ended up in
Wow.
prison at the time.
Wow.
And, I don't know if my parents knew all of that, but they were certainly pretty scared. And for me, this was the turning point where I said, I'm going to take control of my life. And for
Yeah.
now, that means I need to sort out my grades, and I
Yeah.
need to, get good grades and get to university, and I need to disassociate myself from this group because they're not good for me.
Yeah.
Um,
I, I love that, by the way, just because, I mean, it resonates for me. And I shared with you about my own kind of coming to spirituality and religion at the age of 18, much similar to you. And it just feels to me that there are moments where our soul is searching for truth, it's searching for truth, or, it's I once heard a quote, to know itself. And we're looking in all the wrong directions, innocently. And then when it kind of hears that truth, it resonates on such a deep vibrational level that's so life changing. And it really does, as you say, change the trajectory of your life when it hits you that hard. Just out of interest, did it do the same for your parents to the degree that it did for you?
uh, yeah, I think it did, and yes, I did, in their own way. I think almost they they could, for the first time, see a religion that and or a faith that was more universal,
Mm,
that they could understand and engage with.
mm,
They found a place where they could ask questions and be
mm.
curious. But I think alongside that was also what they were seeing me go through.
You,
So I think
yeah,
initially, at least, it was very much to say, okay, we need to facilitate this. And I would have questions, and we were in this small centre in Crawley, and so they would drive me to South London where there was a bigger centre, or to Wembley where there was the kind of the headquarters where there were other people who might try and answer the questions that I was asking, or
yes,
um, so I think it
yeah,
started very much like that. But yes, very, yeah, they found and continue to this day to find a huge amount of
mm,
kind of beauty, truth, and belonging through their
yeah.
faith and their understanding of it.
And I want to talk more about how that almost healed this feeling of not belonging, as you spoke about it, and you mentioned this, finding that within yourself, seeing that within ourselves, deep within ourselves, we can feel such a deep sense of okayness and belonging, that we don't need to get it from outside of us, or
Yeah.
we need to get it less and less from outside of us. It looks less and less relevant. It's true to me, psychological freedom, when a person discovers that. I always see it as such a gift. I feel like all humans are given opportunities to see this, to acquire this knowledge, but oftentimes we bypass it, and to be able to capture that and integrate it is a real gift. And I know that, Mitesh, you, as I think a real truth seeker, you didn't want to, I've heard you say, pay lip service to when you started to get involved in the spiritual journey. So you decided to take this really seriously. So what came next for you after these spiritual classes? What was next in your kind of spiritual journey?
um, the so yeah, we started with those classes on the Bhagavad Gita, kind of lectures almost. Then they were kind of on a Saturday night, rather than roaming the streets, I had the alternative to attend kind of a discussion. So where the young people, particularly, I think it was once I was 16, so it was around that time, the young people would get together and discuss what they were learning and kind of different related topics. And so that became a place that I started to go and attend. And as I was saying, I would seek out some of the older, I guess, masters and those who'd been practicing this for a long time to interrogate them, almost to figure out, what were they, was this all, were they just, was this all just propaganda, or was there real substance to this? And there was one particular, I guess that I always used to call him an uncle almost, who lived in Morden, and we would take walks in Richmond Park, and I would ask him like 100 questions about this, and he would very patiently answer me as we would be walking and seeing the deer and everything else. And I look back on it now, and I was kind of 17, 18, and he was in his 50s or 60s, and we struck up this beautiful friendship, almost. And I'd heard then that the founder of this kind of movement was, lived in Mumbai and had a university, almost a monastery of sorts, where he taught, and where you could go and live effectively as a monk for a year or a couple of years. And so in my mind, I'd set that, okay, I need to do this, and I need to know whether this is going to be the foundation for the rest of my life or not. This seems too important to do half-heartedly. But you needed to be a graduate holder to go, so it's kind of a postgraduate qualification of sorts. And so I kind of got through my degree at LSE, and even before I waited for my graduation, as soon as my last exam finished, I'd left to go to India. And I remember I was allowed 2 pairs of clothes, one that I was going to wash and one that I was going to wear. And I had to buy like a little straw mat that I would sleep on at night. And it was full on.
Sure. So what did you learn in that year? What happened in that year? Like, how did it move you along your spiritual journey?
So I think for me, it was it was around 200 other students. Around 180 or so were from around India, so the different states of India, whereas maybe 20, 25 were from England and America and kind of other parts of the world. And it was, initially it was incredibly visceral. It was learning to sleep on the floor and grow our own food and cook our own food and, deal with the mosquitoes and with the heat and, with a very, very simple diet. And I remember being quite sick initially and kind of getting through that. And, and the classes were very different because the teachers weren't paid to teach. So they taught at universities locally, but lived on campus in this monastery. And so they would always say to us that, we're not being paid to teach you. For us, the reward is you learning. And so I remember one particular teacher would take the same class again and again, and we'd get really frustrated with him because we were like, why are you taking it? And he, there was usually one kid in the class who was kind of asking a question who clearly wasn't understanding what was going on. And then, and the moment that the teacher felt that, he would repeat the class. And so all of us realized, right, that kid, we've got to make sure he understands the class, so that when the teacher, because the teacher would always ask him first to say, what did you understand? So we all took it upon ourselves to kind of tutor him after the class, so that when the teacher would ask him, he'd know what to say, so the class could move on. Little did we know that was part of the education. it was,
Becoming
not not the survival of the fittest. They used to say, fit the unfit to survive,
beautiful.
was the kind of motto. And a lot
Mm,
of the learning, it was just so different to, I remember feeling quite disillusioned having gone to LSE and it being such a, hallowed, revered institution. And I was like, nobody really cares. The teachers just want me to go
yes.
and buy all these expensive books that they wrote.
Mm,
And,
mm,
as long as I memorize them, I'll probably do okay in the exams. But I felt very, uninspired. And, this
yes.
couldn't be more different, where it wasn't about the content. It
And
wasn't about the
yes.
material. It was about the experience. So I don't
Yeah.
wouldn't even know where to begin. It was life changing.
Sounds incredible. And, if you could just bottle that and put that into our education system, I think that kids would grow up, we grow up very, very differently because, as you say, there's such a vast difference between trying to stuff information or intellectual knowledge into a person as opposed to drawing out something from them,
Yeah,
and that's when it becomes, as you say, experiential and you're actually living. And I just love the way it almost feels like they stripped the element, they strip back everything, so you're literally living in the elements, with nature. It reminds me of when, in the summer, I was lucky enough to go to Botswana, and we got to hang out with the bushmen, like original bushmen, because
wow.
sometimes they're a bit contrived, for tourists, but these really were the last kind of remaining. And it was such a privilege to hang out with them for a few days. We're in the Kalahari, and they just live with nothing. They live in the elements, and they're so spiritual, and they're so happy, and they're not, as because as we haven't yet said, but Mitesh, you sat in one of our AHAD courses that we did, our resilience programs in your business. And um, part of what we share is that as humans, we outsource our okayness, our peace of mind, our sense of security to so many different factors. And because they don't have those outsources, not to, material wealth and not to other people needing to appreciate them, there's a wisdom and there's like an inner fulfillment and a way that they operate, and they're so in tune with nature. I mean, they would just stop in what looked like bare ground and say that there's a tuba under here, and then we'd all dig and dig and dig, and then come out with this big tuba, which they then sharpen their little branch, which became a knife, and we'd cut it and we'd eat it and squeeze out the liquid. And then they had such reverence for the earth, which takes care of them, that they would put everything back as it was. And it was just beautiful to see the love and sense of community they had with each other. And it reminds me a little bit of what you're talking about. I felt that if I hung out with them, and we all felt that, my husband and my child was there, my mother who we took with, we felt like we'd become better humans if we just hung out with them. So yeah.
It's an incredible, right? It's our understanding of what is civilized,
Mm,
and professional and modern, and how
yeah.
that is so much better, and more
Yes.
advanced. And yet
Yes.
you can be with the most primitive people in this way, in a sense, and yet they are so much more advanced in terms of their understanding of themselves, their connection with each other, their connection with the land and with nature. And I
Yes.
remember in one of our first few classes when we arrived, the teacher had taken us all out, particularly those of us who'd come from the West. And he said, I can't teach you anything until you give up this notion that you're better because you're from the West.
Wow.
And he said, I almost need to let this brainwashing kind of undo itself before
Yes.
you're even ready to learn.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so it was like, it's like thousands of years of civilization that makes
Exactly.
you think there's an ego and a sense that you're so much better than the
Yeah.
other students who come here from the villages in India. And there's a sense that you know better, and because
Yeah.
your head is stuffed full of equations and
Mhm.
science. And he said, I need you to be able to strip all of that back. And so he kind of systematically deconstructed
Yes.
that
Yeah.
before and we were like, but all the other classes are like 2, 3 months in, like we're still here. And it's like,
Yes.
there's no point. There's no point until you give this up. And so
Yeah.
it reminded me of that as you were talking.
It's an unlearning, right? As humans, it's almost an unlearning to uncover what's this wisdom that's within us, but we've got so much covering it that we have to kind of strip that away. And,
Right.
and yeah, and that's not easy. But Mitesh, this period of your life, you had said to me before that this laid the spiritual kind of and cultural foundations for your life and for your family's life. And I could really resonate it with me because I felt that that's what coming across religion, spirituality did for me. And I'd mentioned to you that this past year had been a year of a lot of loss for me. I lost my father a year ago, and I lost my sister a few months ago, and I felt this kind of the spiritual knowledge, and it's held me. It's given me a different perspective, and it's kind of the backdrop and the context through which I understand life and live life and make decisions. And that's been the same for my children, And I feel that it's watching them grow up. I feel that there was a lightness and almost because they loved the spirituality. It was beautiful. They got a lot out of it, but it also really grounded them in something very meaningful, which is hard for young people to find in the secular world that we live today, especially
Yeah.
where there's so many loud voices and influences, and figuratively, literally, that kind of drown out, the kind of values that parents hope to give their children. So how has that kind of impacted how your family, what you learned in that year, what you've continued to learn?
Um, yeah, it's interesting what you're saying. It's almost in your adversities um, that you realize the value of it, of that
Mm,
spirituality even more, I found.
definitely.
Um,
Mm,
when, and I think for a lot of life after coming back from India, I mean, I had got married just before I went. And so, I met the love of my life at university and proposed, and we decided there was no point waiting. We would get married. So we got married in our final year. And so
mhm,
then it was doubly hard to leave her because she'd started working and then go to India for this. And so a big part of coming back was almost taking her on that journey with me.
mm,
And again, not through books and teaching, but through living together and, you know,
mm,
working through things. And so a lot of our kind of early years of marriage was almost kind of, you know, uh, discussing those and working through those and coming at things from very different perspectives
yes,
and
yes.
trying to find, a way in which we would move forward. And, and I think it gave a really spiritual foundation to our marriage.
Mm,
And, a few years later, we felt then we were ready to have children. And we had three children, kind of a couple of years apart, a girl, boy, and then a girl. And,
mm.
my wife and I were both only children. So it was
Oh,
really
wow.
nice for us to be able to have
Yeah. Yes.
three. And neither of us were unhappy only children. We could kind of see the pros and cons of it, but just loved for them to have others,
Mm,
and
mhm,
kind of their own to, maybe to belong to, to,
uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah.
and
Uh-huh.
there was something about that that just felt really appealing. And again, I know for my wife, when she lost her father a few years ago, she said it's probably when I felt most where I wish I had other siblings who
Mm,
I could share this with, who, when he was ill, and it was kind of a year and a bit of him suffering with cancer, that she was kind of caring for him. And, it was all on her. And
yes.
it was when she really felt it. And again, we felt validated in this decision that we'd had
Mm,
three children. So yeah, the spirituality has been a very kind of big part. We'd be working in the day and in our evening. And a big part of this philosophy was not armchair philosophy, but trying to see goodness and divinity in others, and almost devotion being an act of service.
Yes.
And the fact that anything you do, if you do it
Yeah.
out of service, not just
Yes.
for the person or the situation, but for the goodness within them, then it
Mm,
becomes an act of devotion. And so,
beautiful.
so much of our life, the question we were asking ourselves is, could our married life be an act of devotion? Could raising a family be an act of devotion? Could
Mm,
obviously the various charitable and other activities that we were doing
mm,
felt like it. So, with our friendships, with so much of what we were doing, it was an experiment, right? It was trying
yes.
to learn in an incredibly, I worked in the city, and I was, working in finance,
Mm-hmm.
and in investment, and, in an environment that is so obsessed with money and status and
Yes.
acquisition of things. And I definitely feel like it was a bit of a pendulum. There were times that I'd get sucked into that, and there were things, often adversity, that would
Mm-hmm.
pull me back towards my spirituality. I don't think I would plot it as a straight line.
Yes.
And
Yes.
bringing it all the way up to more recently, in the last few years, yeah, as I said, my wife's dad was very sick, and then he passed away, and that was a really difficult time for us as a family. And then my dad had not been very well, and again had cancer, but was able to get surgery and get better. And then soon after, I was in a really stressful job. I was CEO in a firm where the
Mm-hmm.
founders and I hadn't, they were struggling to let go, and I was, trying to take on that role. And then eventually they had let go, but I felt less control, and again had made the mistake of outsourcing my identity to this company
Uh-huh.
that I'd had the privilege to grow from 50 people to 250 people. And
Uh-huh.
I'd like carefully handpicked each person, and had, for the first time in my career, a chance to define a culture,
Yes.
and for it to not just be about profit, and for
Yes.
to really put a kind of human beings at the center of it. But it had become so much of an extension of me that
Yes.
I had started to identify myself with
Yes.
it.
Uh-huh.
And that had caused kind of levels of stress
Yes.
and frustration and,
Yeah.
physical sickness that I
Yes.
hadn't experienced before. I became intolerant to dairy and gluten and caffeine, and I was just
Wow.
sick.
Wow.
So there was all these things going on, and I think that's almost when, and then the final piece was my daughter, my eldest daughter. We discovered that she was suffering from depression
Mm-hmm.
and anxiety, and she'd started to self-harm. And it had kind of, after, it was around the middle of 2020, so after the first lockdown, that we'd seen that she was very withdrawn. And
Mm-hmm.
we'd then discovered that she was suffering, and she struggled to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, and so we began a journey of kind of trying to understand that, and trying to show her that our love for her was unconditional, yet dealing with the pain of seeing your
Mm,
child harming themselves, and learning, almost unlearning again, and learning about that and what she was going through, and
mm,
examining what we were doing, initially feeling like, what have we done wrong?
yes.
And
Yes.
then, learning that it's not about us. This is about her experience. And again, trying to remember that this is her soul.
Mm,
And what is that journey, and what can she gain from it, and what is the role we need to play? And I think it was that time that we were really conscious that work was hard, home was difficult. My wife and I both felt we were up often through the night
mm,
checking on her, so we were
mm,
sleep deprived, we were stressed, and worried and terrified really at times. And then there were things going on with parents as well, and we were just really conscious that we needed to look after ourselves. And
yes.
it was around that time that we had just decided that we would roll out the iHeart Resilience program amongst our senior team.
Mm-hmm.
And so I put my hand up immediately to say, this
Yeah.
feels like an act of self-care. And I didn't really know much about it at the time. I just knew that I needed to center myself. And I was just so blown away that it was, the philosophy, the ideas resonated so deeply, and actually, reminded me of so many things that I'd kind of forgotten almost in the midst of it, that kind of came straight back to the surface, and were able to kind of center us again and help us kind of work through this time.
It's amazing. I mean, there's so many things you said there that I want to unpack a little bit, but just before we go, I want to go backwards a little bit. But I just wanted to ask you, what was it that you, if you can recall any of what you heard in the course that was helpful to you at this time?
Yeah, I think at the heart of it, and at its simplest, was this idea um, that the sunshine, as you depicted it on the course, or this
Hmm.
light, this warmth, this beauty, uh, is within us,
Mm,
and it is often obscured by
mm,
various things, but it's within us, and we search for it outside. And
mm.
it's recognizing that any time that you're outsourcing your happiness, your health, your well-being, whether it is to your job, whether it is to your child who is suffering,
Yes.
whether it is to a situation, and I think for a lot of our lives, we'd learned to not outsource our happiness to things and
Mm-hmm.
or to status. And, those things had been really obvious in a sense because of that spiritual background. But I think we had, as parents, got caught up in, and as professionals got caught up in even kind of deeper levels of attachment.
Yes.
And I think that's what had really struck home, to say, okay, I get it. That's what we're doing here.
Yeah.
And, the answer is actually within us, and we need to, we're on the wrong path and we need to get back on the right path. And I think
Mm,
those ideas really clearly struck a chord,
yeah.
and were things I could, we could practice. I came home kind of telling my wife all about it, and then kind of working through it together.
Yeah. This kind of outsource, as you say, the one of outsourcing our well-being to the people we love's well-being, whether it's physical or psychological, so that we feel we are only okay if our children are okay. We can only be okay if our loved ones are okay, is such a difficult one for humans, because it almost feels, especially with our children, that they're almost a part of us. We're them and
Yeah,
they're us, and they've come from us and they are of us. So it feels that if they're not okay, we're not okay. It feels like our very survival is tied to them, and there's this umbilical cord. And it creates such a difficult situation, because even when our children are doing well, there's an insecurity there, because our okayness is dependent on them doing well.
yeah,
And kids feel that, there's an unspoken dialogue that's happening that doesn't even have to be spoken. But essentially, we're just like puppets on a string. As they do well, we do well. As they don't, we don't, and we go up and down accordingly. And there's so
and
many.
that's a lot. That's a heavy burden for them to carry, right? For
It's a
them to carry our happiness and well-being.
Exactly. And I think that's what you felt with your parents, when you were growing up, to a degree. And there's no judgment in it, because it's such a human thing and it's so innocent. But if we can start to weaken, if not break, that umbilical cord and feel that our well-being is separate to theirs, I think it's one of the most powerful things I've seen for myself with my teenagers, when they weren't doing well and I was doing well. And that doesn't mean that you're not compassionate, that you're not supportive, that you're not
Yeah,
creative, but it just means that they sense, and it's giving them a message that I believe that, this is your journey, as you say, this is your soul journey. You're what we call in our heart on the off track road. You're grappling with life, but you have the resources within you. And this journey is going to allow you to uncover them. The grappling and the struggle that you're going through is going to help you uncover them. We'll be there to support you, but in the
yeah,
meantime, like, we're okay, like, and because we have that faith in you, it allows us, it frees us to be okay. And I think that that does something for children that is so powerful,
yeah.
and for ourselves, of course, it's very freeing and
We
settling.
we would repeat to ourselves every night that she has everything within her
Yeah.
to be able to deal with, what it is that life has thrown at her.
Mm,
And and recognizing that life is, brings both suffering and
Yes.
good and bad, hard and difficult, and learning to go through that often are some of the most valuable kind of lessons and experiences of life. But we'd learned this, that really early on in her illness, that if we're rescuing, she
Yes.
has no choice but to assume the victim role.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's only when we stop rescuing that she
Yes.
can step out of that and take
Yeah.
ownership and control of her own kind of life. And it was
Yes.
such an important kind of unlearning of this very paternal parental instinct
To
to
protect, save,
to
and
protect
control. Yeah.
exactly, yeah, to
Yeah.
let go and say she has what she needs within her. We trust that she
Yes.
will get through this. And
Yeah.
she was craving that. She was craving that space to be able to figure it out and to work through it.
Yeah.
And she was desperate to not be a burden on us, or to she could see and sense everything we were going through, and she didn't. So it was stopping her from talking to us and sharing what she was going
Yes.
through. And so by us stepping back and showing her we trusted her, she was able to
Mm-hmm.
drive and seek help, and ask for help when she needed it, and find solutions and work through it. And it's been a beautiful, painful but beautiful journey to watch her
Yes.
do. And she's now at a stage at which she's still grappling through it, but she's got so much more of a sense of understanding why she feels the way she does and what she does about it. And she's written a play.
Wow.
So she's studying drama at A level, and she's written a play to capture her journey that she wants to put on the stage in London this summer.
Wow.
So she's trying to find a West End theatre that will let her put on this story, because she's learned through this how many young people, teenagers in particular, are struggling with mental health at
Yes.
alarming rates, with very little support and provision from the NHS and or
Mm.
from communities and parents who don't understand or know what to do.
Wow.
Um, and I know for her, a lot of her troubles had started with her trying to care for. She's a real empath, and she was seeing others suffer around her and was trying to
Mm.
help them and taking on their
Yes.
pain without knowing how to look after herself.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
so,
Yeah.
but again, even with spirituality, I think my kids as teenagers are going through a phase where we're not pushing it very hard because they
Yeah.
have to discover it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really important that we're
Yeah.
not kind of spoon feeding it to them.
Yeah.
They know it, they've grown up in an
Yeah.
environment where it's been all
Yes.
around, but
Yeah.
they have to discover it, and it has to be at the right moment when, when, when it's, when they need it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I'm finding that with her at the moment as she's figuring out her journey through it, and I'm sure the others will in their own time and in their own way.
Yeah, it's very it's a complete it brings such joy to parenting. Sometimes people say to me, how did you have like six boys? That's so much. It must have been so hard. But it wasn't. Parenting was the most joyful. And it's because, as you say, the way that through the learning I'd done and through my own struggles, the way I parented my children was not taking responsibility for their journey. Joseph Campbell speaks about the hero's journey. And, I think for a lot of you get called to these adventures, what he calls these adventures, and it's going through those adventures that is carving out the kind of balanced human that we're trying to be. And
Yeah,
if you don't allow our children to freely be the hero of their journey and go through those adventures, we're stunting them. And
with its
and
trials and tribulations, right?
exactly, with its trials and tribulations. And so we've just been filming a new parenting course, and part of it is how you can be an effective guide to your child on their journey rather than trying to jump in and be the hero of their journey. But I loved what you also said about the spirituality, because I always say to my children, like, my job is quite an easy job as a parent, because it's to impart the wisdom that I have when I have it, because sometimes it gets covered up by my own stuff. But when it's uncovered, I'm going to be imparting it to you again and again. And then it's up to you to integrate it or not. Like, that's your journey and that's your freedom of mind. I had the same on mine. I made decisions my parents weren't happy with, but I needed to go through that. And in that way, when you don't take responsibility for them integrating what you're teaching them, etc. But you freely offer it patiently and, again and again, because it is a marathon, not a sprint, this parenting job. Then it's interesting how over time I've come to see, especially as my kids have grown up and matured and become parents themselves, how much they've integrated and how much they appreciate. Even, my 20-year-old who's studying in a, similar to your kind of monastery, the equivalent in all 5 of my boys are studying in a Torah spiritual learning place. They've been studying for many years in Israel. And my 20-year-old just said to me, he realized that there were so many life lessons and things that were embedded in his upbringing that he just took for granted. He didn't realize. But now that he's with other people who didn't have the same, he's so grateful for it. So it comes, and our job is just to keep offering it. And you actually wrote something that I think is I want to quote, because I think this is very powerful. You wrote this in your blog, which I want to come to and ask you about your blog, and that kind of opening yourself up. But you said, I've become more sympathetic and alert to this, having seen the dark side of giving. I'm not saying I'm ready to rush headlong into selfishness, but there's clearly a balance to be found here. We need to trust that the people around us can deal with their pain, overcome their adversity, and can thrive without needing to rush in to rescue and fix, denying them their greatest lessons and insights. And then you quoted C.S. Lewis saying, hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. And I love that because that sums it up beautifully, really beautifully. I actually wanted to share with you, if you don't mind, another quote that I thought was, I've been reading a book on grief, different books, trying to learn about grief as it's obviously a part of my life now. It's called Bearing the Unbearable, this book, and it's got this beautiful quote by James Baldwin, not sure who he is, but he says, it's not actually that quote. That was a different one. This one is by Elio Frattaroli, and it says, it's typically American, and I don't think it's only American, but he writes, it's typically American to equate healing with doing something. When we have a problem, we fix it, and we prefer to do it quickly. But fixing is not the same as healing. In fact, it can easily get in the way of healing. Healing happens not through doing, but through feeling. And there's something about that for me, that a human has to feel and experience their own journey and their own pain and their own struggle in order to heal. Rumi says that the cure for pain is in the pain. And there's something about allowing the people we love, to have that. I think it's quite respectful to allow them to have their, as you say, it's part of the experience of being human, and not try and deny it and fix it and stop it and change it and stick plasters over it. As challenging as that is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for us, the suffering that we experienced as parents was a really, I can look at it, and even though we're not fully through it, I can see it as a blessing. It's brought insights, it's brought realizations that we couldn't possibly have had outside of that. And again, friends and family wanted to help, but we had to go through that and, find inspiration, but also find kind of deep resilience and reserves within ourselves, and not just surviving, but really thriving through that. And so, when I wrote that, it was really at the start of the year, and I was kind of reflecting back over the last year, which had been such a roller coaster, and recognizing that there had been such beauty. We'd both been, my wife and I, really service orientated, and so there had been this want to be there, to run to the rescue of anyone who needed it, especially our own children and parents and others, and had never realized that we were making them weaker or making them dependent or denying them their journey. And again, it was with our own children starting to, you called it the umbilical cord, but for us, it was kind of, remember, we were thinking we can choose control or connection.
I love that.
And we can't have both. And it was starting to let go of control, to say, yes, they may have come from us, but they don't belong to us.
Beautiful.
And we were never really very materialistic in in identifying with physical things. But again, we hadn't realized when our children had become, these attachments that we had that taken ownership for, and
Yes.
it was
Yes.
neither good for us nor them.
Yeah.
So again, I feel like our spiritual journeys, and I think it's one of the most beautiful things of life when I reflect on it, that, as you grow up and you raise a family, and then you've got to learn to let go of them. And so you're
Yes.
constantly, your ego and your soul has got this beautiful kind of journey that it's going on, learning to let go of them. And then losing our loved ones is another kind of stage of that journey.
Yeah.
But all the way through to when we start to lose aspects of ourselves, whether it's our beauty or our physical health and
Mm.
fitness. And we've seen a lot of kind of people age or die at kind of all ages, and it's really, I know for me, I've been reflecting a lot on, this is the beauty of life, and
Yes.
to
Yes.
embrace it
Yeah.
and not
Yeah.
be fearful of it, and to
Yeah.
not be so protective of it. So
Yeah. You
it's
know,
interesting. It's kind of excited in a sense about that, the spiritual journey that is still to come,
yes.
that
Yes.
maybe can only come at these key moments in life
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
can't necessarily anticipate
Yeah.
or shortcut.
It's so true. And as you say, when they come, they're painful, but there's so much beauty in them when they become this learning. And, I remember when my father was when he was dying, and thank goodness, as opposed to my sister, he didn't have a lot of pain, but he was very uncomfortable. And this kind of powerful man who'd been a very successful business person and was the protector of the family and was a mentor and a sage to everybody around him, he's everything was deteriorating and breaking down, and he was started to wear diapers, and he was looked after by a carer. And on one hand, I remember like my mother being so devastated by that, especially when that kind of happened. And I had this like insight. I realized like we come out of the womb, that way. And now he's going back to that. It's almost a reversal because he doesn't need this body anymore. It was just a casing for this world. And so he's shedding it. He doesn't need it. And so it's dying, the physicality, but that's because there's something that's going to transcend it and has to let go of it. And it looked so
Yeah,
perfect. There's something about those lessons that we get, as you say, in these moments, in difficult moments that are very beautiful. They are very beautiful, and they're very settling because they ground you in kind of what matters and what it's all about. Because it's so hard to kind of keep grounded when there's so many distractions, as you
yeah.
say, and we start to identify with so many things, in our lives. But
And
Mitesh, I wanted to just ask you one question, just because I didn't want to skip this, because you had said, when we'd quoted already what you'd said in a blog that you had written. And when you started to establish career success, and you were CEO of Reddington, you had said that a mentor had started to encourage you to open up, to reveal more of yourself. And so one of the things you did was write a blog. And 3 years into your blog, you said, I don't think I'm hiding any part of myself. And you, by your own acknowledgement, you're someone who was quite private, and so to do that must have been pretty difficult. Why was that so important, to start to reveal more of yourself and open up in that way?
uh, a couple of things really. So that yeah, my coach, as I was preparing for the CEO role, would say to me often that, when you are in that leadership role, people need to know how you'll behave when they're not in the room. They need to
Mm,
know what your values are, what choices you make, because they affect all of them. And so, you being so private isn't going to serve you well,
yes,
in this role. And so you've got to open up. And he was like, you're like an onion. You've got to peel back these layers.
yes,
And it wasn't until then that I realized I'd done it. But part of it was, we didn't, as I started work and as I moved through work, whilst I wasn't craving that belonging anymore, I knew I was different.
mm-hmm,
And so whether it was my spirituality, or whether it was the fact that I didn't drink alcohol, or I was married really young, or there was all these other things that I was prioritizing in my life that my colleagues couldn't relate to. And so it just became private. It was something I wouldn't share. I'd kind of do work, and
Yes.
then I,
Do Mitesh.
have this fulfilling, life almost outside of work, and
Yes.
work kind of was a means to an end. And I struggled with that because I wanted my work to be more fulfilling.
Yes.
And so I'd left jobs and changed jobs and trying to find something. And again, this opportunity at Reddington was a real chance to take profit and purpose and kind of a meaningful role, doing something more meaningful in a kind of a challenger brand that was
Mm-hmm.
looking to do good. The mission was to make 100 million people financially secure. And
Mm-hmm.
it was okay. I get to use my financial investment knowledge for good rather than just to make money or make the rich richer, or
Mm.
to make ourselves wealthier. And so, uh, but I hadn't really realized that actually one of the biggest inhibitors to becoming a leader, and I think this is true for so many people, particularly those who've come from diverse backgrounds, whether that be from poverty or whether it be from other races or religions, that often we hide ourselves. Often
Yes.
our colleagues only see a fraction of who we
Mm.
really are.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it was a very deliberate decision, and it started with a blog. And then it grew from there into me talking about, initially I could only really express myself through writing. And so that
Yes.
it was more than that. It was
Safe.
getting up at the
Yeah.
podium and, having
Yes.
conversations like this, and,
Yes.
really exposing myself and saying things I was scared of. But actually there's been a real beauty and spirituality in it, because deep down, don't we all just wish to be seen
Mm-hmm.
as we truly are, and to be
Mm.
loved and accepted for
Mm-hmm.
who we are? And I think for a lot of my life, I've hidden parts of myself,
See.
and
Yes.
maybe we all do.
Mm.
And, you know, there's a, there is a, there's a difficulty in that. There
Yes.
is a lack of belonging. There is a lack of real, true love and self-acceptance almost.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's in a really interesting way. Not only has that kind of helped me be a more effective leader, but actually it's been an incredibly spiritual journey, and I've learned to really value that. And again, I still think I'm peeling back
Yes.
layers,
Yes.
but I'm very conscious of it and I'm very deliberate of it. And
Yes.
I'll do it even when it terrifies me. So spirituality is, in a sense, the most recent thing that I've only really in the last year or two started to talk about, and talk
Really.
about openly, even though it's been
Yes.
such a big part of my life.
Wow. That's beautiful, and it needs to be talked about more. So, good for you. I wanted to read you something that just spoke to a little bit to what you spoke about sharing yourself. And it says, it's also another, this is the quote by James Baldwin. It says, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world. But then you read, and it was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who are alive or had ever been alive." And there's something so connecting about sharing our vulnerabilities and sharing out, because other people recognize that in themselves. These are human things, and it's extremely connecting. So I think that's a
Well,
huge
this is the
reason.
thing, right? Every human being
Yeah,
will have these ups and downs of life, these stages of life,
exactly.
whichever route they go through, in a sense.
Yeah,
That it's not discriminating of it. It doesn't matter whether you
exactly.
come from poverty
Yeah,
or wealth. And what
yeah.
I find really interesting, and something I've been doing more and more at work, is encouraging others to talk about their feelings and their emotions and their deeper experiences. And you get lots of people who say, but that's not what work is for. Work
Yes.
is meant to be a place where it's much more clinical. We leave those things at home. But actually, what I found is, but those are the things that connect us.
Yeah.
So the more diverse our workplaces become, the more we make an effort. And as an industry, I think we're making a huge effort to bring in people of different generations, of different
Mm,
races and ethnicities, of different religions and genders and otherwise. But that's not enough. And,
Yes.
that can create an environment where there's a lot more strife and a lot more difficulty and a lot less belonging, but also, and where there can be more cliques.
Yes.
And one of the things that I found incredibly powerful is talking about emotions.
Yes.
And so I have
Yes.
we've been doing a quarterly session that we call Perspectives, where we'll invite everyone in the firm to attend. And,
Yes.
these things are sold out. I mean, so many people of the firm turn up, whether virtually or physically, to listen to stories. And we'll get
Wow.
a cross section of the firm to share stories which are linked to an emotion. So it could be, belonging, or it could be, feeling like an imposter, or
Yes.
whatever else it might be that,
Yes.
different people are talking about in different ways, uh,
Yes.
through very different lenses, and yet they're all connected by and connect to others. So I think in our workplaces we could do, it's not only a nice to have, but if we're truly going to have not only diverse but inclusive workplaces where people can thrive, different people can thrive, we have to go deeper. And that comes down to the realm of emotions and
Beautiful.
values and spirituality and these things that we never talk about at work.
I love that. And then just you must be I want to come work for you. Because, it's an incredible leader. You can just see how, because there's something universal, that binds us all. And um, when you're connecting on that level, it does something for humans, which is going to have a knock-on effect into all areas, as you say, of work life and home life. But because also the differences can often feel like barriers, as you say, and they can actually feel disconnecting. But there's something beneath the differences, which is the
Yeah,
same. And that's what you want people to touch into. And that's when the differences become less relevant.
right.
They're important because they are part of our culture and we're proud of them, but they don't create a separation anymore because you see that connection is happening on a deeper level. And that
Yeah.
sounds like that's what you're engendering, which is beautiful and lovely. So Mitesh, thank you. Gosh, there's I could go on forever talking to you, and I know our time's running out,
Vice
and
versa.
yeah, I really, really would love to. But I'm going to end off with this. In Hebrew, there's the word for a wise person. When we talk about a wise person, the Hebrew word is Talmid Chacham. Talmid means a student, and Chacham means wisdom. It's a student of wisdom, and that's what a wise person is defined as. There's another saying that a wise person is someone who learns from everyone. Um, and and I was just thinking, like, for me, you epitomize a wise person, a student of wisdom, because you've dedicated your life, it seems, to grappling and reflecting and learning in order to better yourself and better the world around you. And I just wondered if you could leave us with, what are you learning right now? Like, what's right now on top of your mind?
um, very briefly, just before I go there, so the movement that I referred to, that was began by this kind of philosopher who's not alive anymore. It was called Bandarang Shastri Atavale, born in India and then took his work around his work. But he called the movement Swadhyay, which is a Sanskrit word, and Swa means self, and Dhyay or Dhyayan comes from to study. So it was the
Yes,
study of the self. Um,
yes,
and so I've often, described myself as a student of the self, as a student of life. So it's so funny well,
mm,
not funny, but interesting that you shared what you did, because it is very much this kind of. I do see myself and those around me as seekers and in
yeah,
search and trying to find that deeper meaning and perspective and undercurrents, and trying to
mhm,
connect deeper than just what we're the kind of that what they say, spiritual beings living a human existence rather
yes,
than
yes,
the other way around.
yes, yes.
Um,
Exactly, because what presents in front of us, and it's looks so real and it's so distracting, but there's something going on underneath that can make sense of that in a different way. But you have to look deeper, and as you say, within ourselves to get glimpses of that and learn more about that. That to me is why we're here, on Earth.
yeah,
That's yeah.
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
to answer the second part of your question, I mean, very, very immediate and current. My son,
Yes.
so my second, he's sitting his GCSEs at the moment,
Uh-huh.
and they start in about 10 days. And we've had to remind ourselves again that he's on his own journey.
Yes.
We desperately want to make him study and
Yes.
to make him take this a lot more seriously than he appears to be.
Yes.
But my wife and I have been kind of daily kind of there, and as you were saying earlier, seeing that beauty and divinity within him, and trusting that he will make the right decisions for him, but also recognizing that this isn't just about a set of exams, even though we put so much focus on it as a
Yes.
society. But
Yes.
this is just another milestone in his journey. And
Yes.
yes, we could force him to work and to study, but we will deny him an incredible experience in which he has to learn to manage his distractions and
Mm.
to find the discipline to be able to do this. And so, we know that, and yet we're having to kind of remind ourselves of it every single day at the moment. I think this is going to be the case for the next 6 weeks until he's through it, because every day you kind of catch yourself from going, why aren't you studying? Why are you talking to your friends? Why are you gaming? Why shouldn't you be studying? And you just bite your tongue and you catch yourself.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It's very visceral.
But that's such an important lesson for parents, because these things like GCSEs and A levels feel so important. It really does feel as if our child is going to crash out of life if they don't get the marks we think they can get. And I think about recently, I actually bumped into a Robertson who I hold in high esteem, and she was telling me that her son went to study. He was a religious boy, and he went to study in similar institution to where my children are studying, in a yeshiva. He didn't get his A levels. Very clever boy, but he didn't get his A levels. It wasn't prioritized at the school, and he didn't feel motivated to. And he went and studied in one of the highest kind of institutions of this order for quite a few years. And then he, of his own volition, decided he wants to come back and get his A levels. So he came home. He was now in his early 20s. And he studied his A levels, and he actually then got into Cambridge and did law there, and then got a bursary to go to Harvard, and he's now at Yale, Harvard, etc. And that was his journey, and you just kind of see that. I always say that when you create the space for children, often we have this urgency. It almost feels urgency to me as a signpost of being off track, not in our well-being, but it feels like we've got to tell them now, we've got to educate them, we've got to set them straight. And if we can just step back and give them the space, I often find with children, they reset, they get their own insight, they kind of self-correct, but it's difficult for parents to do that, as you say, and particularly around these GCSEs and A levels. So I think this is a really nice lesson for all of us and for all parents who are going through GCSEs. And my little one just started SATs today, but that's that's
All the
so. Thank
best.
you. Yeah, thanks, Mitesh, and thank you so much. Really, really appreciate this conversation, and I wish you and your wife just continued growth and learning on this journey. Sounds like you guys have got a fantastic kind of moral compass and North Star, and just enjoy.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. And again, I'm going to be listening back to this, and I know my wife will want to as well, because there's just such a wisdom in and a calm in and a beauty in how you see the world. And again, we'd never spoken till a couple of weeks ago, and I felt so connected. And
So,
again, and we grew up in very different wisdom traditions, and
exactly.
yet I felt such resonance and
Um,
familiarity, and belonging.
yeah,
So thank you for that.
you're welcome. You're welcome. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please follow or subscribe so that you can stay up to date with our latest episodes.